Hey everyone, Delve here. You can check out my channels here. Today I'm going to cover Faith, another stat in Dark Souls 2. All in all, Faith is a decent stat with some unique benefits over other stats. Okay, we'll start with the upsides. The main obvious upside is the support miracles. This includes the obvious like healing spells, but also the ability to cure poison, which is kind of nice. In practice, lots of these healing ones are pretty alright, not especially useful. The real boon here are the self-buff miracles, which have a variety of interesting uses. Some notable examples include vastly increasing elemental defenses, increasing physical attack and defense, as well as surviving one attack that would otherwise be lethal. The main downside to these is that they don't stack with each other. Otherwise, these are kind of the main show when it comes to miracles. And they can be quite useful. Other than that, you have the obligatory weapon buff in Sunlight Blade, which is kind of nice. All in all, really unique, and a great incentive for adding Faith onto another build. Next, we have the offensive miracles. These are sort of your typical range spells. Compared to sorceries, miracles are mostly worse. They do deal lightning damage, which enemies are often not resistant to. Unfortunately, the cast times are often longer, you have a smaller variety of spells to cast, and the spells themselves deal less damage overall. So I personally think they simply aren't as good as sorceries, at least in terms of sheer damage. However, you can have access to some interesting offensive spells, the main example being a spell that rains lightning in a small area around you. This can be useful against crowds of enemies, large bosses, and even hypothetically other players in PvP. Sadly, by the DLC, they become pretty useless, which is not strictly true of sorceries. You do still have some okay ranged options, and they are quite good in the first half of the game. Lastly, of course, you have access to some weapons which scale with Faith. These weapons deal lightning damage as well as physical, and they can be buffed with Sunlight Blade. As far as your selection is concerned, the weapons that come with Faith scaling are actually quite good, although many of them have highish stat requirements. These weapons are definitely a selling point of the stat. On top of that, you can infuse a weapon with lightning, and when infused, the weapon also gains Faith scaling, so realistically you have access to practically any weapon of your choice. And if that wasn't enough, fire infusions also scale with Faith as well, meaning you even have access to an entire other damage type. Faith scaling weapons are crucial, of course, as you'll need them to help you with the DLC bosses, since DLC enemies take half damage from spells. The damage from these weapons is solid, although not ridiculous, and you end up with a decent character using these weapons. Okay, and obviously there are some downsides. The first one is actually lightning damage itself. While very few enemies are resistant to it, almost no enemies are exceptionally weak to it, as far as I know. And as far as I know, none of the DLC bosses. That doesn't mean it's useless, and a lot of bosses like Dark Lurker, Old Iron King, and Nashandra are all quite weak to it. But on the main, I don't think it's overall a better damage type than Magic, and I definitely don't think it's a better damage type than Thrust or Strike either. It's more underwhelming than anything else, and is just fine, just not impressive. The next downside I already talked about is the spells. Not only do most of them deal less damage than sorceries, but there are also a pretty significant cap on how many spells you can even get your hands on. While you can get a high number of casts of high-profile sorceries like Soul Spear, the game has a hard cap on how many copies you can get of high-profile miracles like Great Lightning Spear. So not only do the spells perform worse, there's not even an easy way to get tons of them so that they could be used as a legitimate range option. Now, you can still easily kill most pre-DLC bosses with miracles, and in fact that's the best way to kill some bosses. But at best it's merely comparable to sorcery, and practically never really even has a niche advantage over it, at least in terms of damage. Lastly, the biggest flaw with miracles, and that's covenants. 3 miracles can only be obtained either via covenants or in New Game++. Unfortunately, farming for these miracles is much more difficult than it would be in Dark Souls, as the covenant items are rarer, and you have to farm more of them. The main example is Sunlight Spear, in theory the strongest miracle, but it requires 30 sunlight medals, which is an outrageously large number to be farming from random enemies. The other covenant is Blue Sentinels, which requires an item which is even harder to farm. Now you might wonder about doing co-op with other players, which is what these covenants are for. But that's still a pretty large number of bosses to successfully co-op, as to get all the miracles, you'd have to co-op 30 bosses in each of the covenants, for a grand total of 60 bosses. So unfortunately, I've written off these miracles as being practically unobtainable, which is a shame since they are theoretically some of the strongest miracles in the game. All in all, I think miracles are not bad, but the foibles surrounding the miracles and how you get them kind of holds them back. Okay, next we'll talk about the game progression. For starters, I chose to play Dark Souls 2, not Scholar of the First Sin here. It may hypothetically make some other things more annoying, but those don't really matter compared to the advantages that Dark Souls 2 has. As for starting class, the obvious choice is Cleric here. Bandit also starts with a Faith of 8, so maybe that would be an acceptable option as well. Don't forget the binoculars in Majula. These will enhance your ranged spellcasting for the rest of the game. The first faith scaling weapon can be obtained pretty fast, and that's the Hide Knight Sword, which can be obtained by killing the Hide Knight in the Forest of Fallen Giants. This is the main reason to play Dark Souls 2 over Scholar of the First Sin, and this weapon is extremely solid. It swings fast, does solid poise damage, it's a good weapon, and can be used throughout the entire game. This can also be found early in Scholar of the First Sin, but only as a rare drop from the Hide Knights in Hyde's Tower of Flame. You would be looking at as much as an hour of farming, maybe less, but maybe as much as an hour. So if you're playing Scholar, I actually recommend using the Fire-Infused Longsword instead, which can be found in the Forest of Fallen Giants. Fire Infusions actually scale with Faith and Intelligence in this game, so it may even be a better option than the Hide Knight Sword. Next is Hyde's Tower of Flame. There's one thing to note here, and that's Licia of Lindelt. She sells a variety of miracles. The main ones of note are Homeward, which is free Homeward Bones, Caressing Prayer, which cures poison, and Lightning Spear, which is a fine offensive miracle. The main issue with it is that you never really get enough casts of it for it to be that useful, at least until it's already obsolete. The next place you probably want to go is the Lost Bastille. Here you can open up Macduff's Workshop and then kill the Ruined Sentinels boss. The reason to do this is because the Priest's Chime can be found in a chest beneath the Servants' Quarters bonfire, and this chime is good enough for the rest of the game. The next location I recommend heading is to Huntsman's Copse, since we'll want to go to the Harvest Valley for miracle-related items. There's also an item of interest here in Huntsman's Copse, that's the Token of Fidelity, which can be located under the bridge leading to the Undead Purgatory. This will open up Blue Sentinel Targray and Hyde's Tower of Flame as a merchant, and he sells some interesting miracles. The main one is Heavenly Thunder, which is quite good against hordes of enemies or against large bosses who get hit by multiple lightning bolts. I highly recommend this spell. And the other one is Emit Force, a generic ranged miracle that's okay. He also sells an unlimited supply of Boltstone, meaning you can easily infuse any number of weapons with lightning as you like. This actually gives Faith a pretty meaningful advantage over other stats, as it can be a huge pain to find these infusion stones. Next is Harvest Valley. A couple things to note here. The first one is Chloanne. She'll sell you an AoE miracle which does damage to hollowed enemies, which can be useful against plenty of enemies and specifically a certain boss. Next, towards the entrance to Earthen Peak, you can locate the Altar of Sunlight. The Covenant itself is kind of useless unless you want to farm 30 Sunlight medals for Sunlight Spear. However, the Covenant Ring itself gives a small buff to miracle damage, so it's not bad. You can also find another copy of Lightning Spear here in Earthen Peak. At some point, Licia will start selling infinite copies of the spell, but by then they will be sadly obsolete. Next is Iron Keep. The main reason to be here is to obtain the Dull Ember, so if you're playing Scholar, you can put this off till later. At this point, there's no reason to not have all your weapons and chimes infused with lightning. You could also take care of No Man's Wharf as well. There's another copy of Emit Force there. Also of note, in the nearby Lost Bastille, after the first bonfire along the main entrance, you can find a Hide Knight wielding a spear if you are not playing Scholar of the First Sin. This Hide Knight will always drop the Hide Knight Spear, another probably fine option, although the stat requirements for the weapon are high enough that I'm not that huge a fan of it. Okay, so you'll next want to head to the Gutter. If you're playing Scholar, there's a Hide Knight somewhere around here who will drop the Hide Knight Lance, which is a solid face scaling weapon. If you're playing in normal DS2, this weapon can be obtained later, and I'll talk about it then. The other main reason to head this way is to obtain the Forgotten Key. This can be used to open the door in the pit, and there is a great lightning spear inside. This is one of the main damage miracles, although it's not really that impressive. In many cases, Heavenly Thunder is actually a better damage miracle, but obviously lacks the same range. Next up is Shaded Woods. The thing you'll want to score here is the Clear Bluestone Ring +1 out of the Foggy area, and I also covered how to obtain that in my intelligence video. The trick is to hit the tree next to the chest a few times, and hopefully the ghost will attack that instead of you. You can also buy Magic Barrier from Head of Vangarl. It's a surprisingly useful miracle in any situation where you might take magic damage. Once you've killed Prowling Magus in Congregation, you can then find Cromwell the Pardoner, who will sell you some decent miracles, mostly just an extra copy of Heavenly Thunder. Okay, so once you've killed the 4 lords, it's time to open up the Shrine of Winter. If you're playing DS2, there will be a Hide Knight here who will drop the Hide Knight Lance. If you're playing Scholar, this Hide Knight is somewhere in the Gutter, not sure where. I actually really like this weapon. It seems to have a relatively high proportion of physical damage, which is really nice since it does thrust damage. It also has low stat requirements and can be used to consistently knock enemies down with the R2. The main problem with it is that it seems to do less poise damage than other lances, so you may not always be able to stagger some enemies before getting the knockdown. Again, there's probably a way to get a weapon with more DPS than the Hyde Knight Sword and Hyde Knight Lance, but I think they're good enough weapons, and I use them for the rest of the game just fine, so I personally recommend them. The Hyde Knight Lance is unfortunately a Twinkling Titanite weapon, which is kind of bad, but that's not the weapon's biggest problem. The biggest problem with the Hyde Knight Lance is that it appears to be modeled after a real-life javelin, so perhaps it was originally planned to be a javelin before being made into a lance at some point in development. Like, they didn't have enough time to implement the throwing stuff, and so they just made it a regular lance. So that's the biggest problem with it. Other than that, it's really great. Also along this path is the Dragon Slayer Crescent Axe. This is another fine weapon that comes with face scaling, although I don't personally see a reason to use it over the Hyde Knight Sword. The nice thing about this weapon though is that it can be obtained well before opening up the Shrine of Winter, so this could be another decent weapon for a Faith character early on if you want to go out of your way to obtain it. Once you get to Drangleic Castle, Chancellor Welliger will sell you a Great Magic Barrier, which is useful in any scenario in which you will have to deal with elemental damage. This is actually a prime spell for the upcoming Looking Glass Knight, and he's the only enemy in the game resistant to lightning damage, so the thrust damage from the Hyde Knight Lance is also a really good idea here as well. Shrine of Amana has one main thing of note, that being the Sunlight Blade Miracle, which is going to be your main damage miracle for all the DLC bosses. It synergizes very well with any of the Hyde Knight weapons, and is your only weapon buff option. Undead Crypt has only one thing of note, that being another copy of Great Lightning Spear hidden behind an illusory wall in the area with the 4 hallways. The total number of casts you can have of Great Lightning Spear is 12. The last copy can be obtained by Strayed after obtaining the King's Ring. That's way too few to be useful against any DLC bosses or even enemies, but it can still be used to easily kill enemies like Nashandra or Darklurker. Strayed will also, at this point, sell you another copy of Sunlight Blade, so at least you have plenty of those for most of the bosses as well. Trading in Velstat's Soul with Strayed will also get you the Sacred Oath Miracle. This is an exceptional miracle that buffs physical attack and physical defense. It can of course be stacked with Sunlight Blade, so you'll deal good damage against bosses, even DLC bosses. The main downside is the high attunement slot requirement, but against bosses that shouldn't really matter too much, since you won't be casting offensive miracles anyway. The last relevant item for a Faith character is the Dragon Chime. This can be obtained by either killing Dark Diver Grandal or by killing the Darklurker, at which point he will then give it to you. When infused with lightning, this is the strongest chime in the game for miracles. Unfortunately, you can't obtain it before reaching Drangleic Castle, assuming you want to fight the Darklurker boss. Another issue with it is that it must be upgraded with Twinkling Titanite, which is a problem. Even worse if you want to make use of a weapon that is also upgraded with Twinkling Titanite, such as the Hyde Knight Lance or the Dragon Slayer Crescent Axe. It's tough enough to obtain enough Twinkling Titanite for one weapon, let alone 2. Luckily, there's a way to farm it with bonfire ascetics. The first way is probably the fastest. That's to burn a bonfire ascetic at the first bonfire in Shrine of Amana, which will respawn the Twinkling Titanite hanging on this branch. Then you just knock it down and then run down and pick it up. This is the easiest and fastest way to farm Twinkling Titanite, although there are probably other locations you could use, specifically the wooden chest in the Dragon Sanctum. You could also easily skip this chime if you don't want to bother finding enough Twinkling Titanite. Priest Chime is actually good enough, since by this point offensive miracles are kind of not so good anymore. Or you could just not fully upgrade the Dragon Chime. You know, it's at +3 or +4, it's already better than a Priest Chime, so it's up to you. You know, it's not really a big deal. Okay, and the last miracle we're talking about, that being Denial. It can be found in Dragon Sanctum, and all it does is prevent you from dying one time. It doesn't stack with other self-buffs like Sacred Oath, but it's strong enough that I think it's a strong candidate to use rather than Sacred Oath. So if you're looking for another option besides Sacred Oath, because it doesn't last very long and stuff like that, Denial is a good option. Okay, now I'll briefly talk about the remaining miracles I haven't covered. The main obvious one is Sunlight Spear. Not only do you have to farm 30 Sunlight Medals for it, but offensive miracles are bad in the DLC anyway, so I just didn't bother. You only get one copy of it anyway, so it's not like you can, you know, have all your attunement slots full of it or something. It just doesn't work that way. So I just don't think it's worth it. And the same idea for Wrath of God. Probably not bad in practice. Probably a really good miracle in point of fact. But useless when considering how difficult it would be to obtain. The last one of note would be Blinding Bolt. This can be obtained from Strayed by trading in the Old King Soul, which can be obtained by beating Old Iron King on New Game Plus, or after having burned a bonfire static at the Angi's Idol bonfire. For starters, it has a faith requirement of 65, which is well over the soft cap, so that's less than ideal, and I'm not a huge fan of it. But the damage isn't bad, and might be decent for larger enemies, or even crowds. But any enemy that frequently moves or is relatively small is probably not a good target for it. It's really more of a PvP miracle, I guess. And of course, when you factor in the fact that DLC bosses are resistant to spells, it's probably smarter just to skip it, but maybe it has some fringe uses. I personally do not recommend going all the way to 65 faith for it, though. On the rings, the usual suspects apply here. Ring of Blades, Flynn's Ring, Chloranthy Ring, and Ring of the Third Dragon are all solid options. Lightning Clutch Ring is also good, and it can be found in Dragon Sanctum. For miracle casting, the obvious choices also apply here. Clear Bluestone Ring, Northern Ritual Band, and Southern Ritual Band, and Sun Seal are all good options. As for armor, you have a couple good options. Lion Mage Armor is a good choice, but so is Saint's Armor. This is either given to you by Licia if your faith is 30 or more, or it drops from her when killed when using the Crushed Eye Orb. If you just kill her, she doesn't drop it, I think, but maybe Melentia sells the armor at that point, so I'm not sure. I mean, you can look that up, but Saint's Armor is a pretty interesting option. It's a really nice armor, and it gives you bonus spell casts, which is actually pretty significant on miracles, since they tend to have a low number of casts. As for character build, pretty standard stuff. Hitting the stat requirements for whatever weapons you want to use is a great idea, and then you'll probably need some attunement to attune more spells. After that, you can pump Faith till you hit about 42, as that's as much as you'll need to cast Great Lightning Spear. And then pumping Adaptability until you have an agility of around at least 105. Long term, you'll probably want a Faith of 50, and an attunement of at least 30. From there, soft capping Endurance and then Vigor is a great idea. Okay, and there's the Faith Guide. All in all, I think Faith is a pretty okay stat. Certainly not the best, but comes with some useful self buffs, which can prove useful in a wide variety of scenarios. Thanks for watching.